Hey, what's up? Hmm? What am I doing? Oh, sorry. I was reading up on mythology again. Mainly Balinese mythology. Hmm? Oh, you want to hear more about it? Sure. So, I was reading about two central figures in Balinese mythology. There's Rangda and Barong. They're pretty important to Indonesia since they're these representations of the cosmic duality of chaos and order. Or, in other words, they represent good and evil. From what I was reading, both figures came from ancient animist beliefs. Animism being the belief that objects or places, things, have some sort of spiritual essence. So, plants or rivers can have spirits in them. Animism came from the Latin anima, which means breath or spirit. So, I'm sure you can see how they relate. But anyway, so Rangda is described as this horrifying, cadaverous looking witch with like really long fangs and unkempt hair. Um, She's the queen of these creatures known as the Layaks, which are basically just evil spirits. Um, she would be associated with things like black magic and death, for example. I heard she was also possibly based on someone called Kalon Arang, which was this like legendary widow sorceress who wanted revenge on a kingdom after her daughter kept being rejected by suitors. The inhabitants of the kingdom, because they feared her mother, who was mainly known as this powerful witch. But anyway, Rangda caused, stuff like plagues. She would incite wars, she would spread fear. Basically, she was this personification of chaos in the world, a big representation of disorder. Barong, however, is the opposite. He is a protective spirit, usually depicted in the shape of a lion like creature. Lions in Asian regions tend to look a lot more different, at least in mythology or historical sites, than the ones from the West. He basically has like really long hair and all these like ornate red and gold adornments all over. And he's the symbol of, well, good, as well as being its leader of goodness. So, unlike Rangda, he represents things like health and peace, and you get the point. Anyway, he's part of this category of beings known as the Banaspati Raja, which are essentially guardian spirits. Still, you know how in Western stories, the quote unquote good guy overcomes the bad guy? Well, Barong is a bit different. He doesn't really defeat anyone. He's more of a guardian of balance. So he's always trying to keep things in equilibrium. So the general gist between these two is that both Rangda and Barong are locked in this eternal conflict. Um, and in the Bali region, they have this thing known as the Barong dance, So the Barong dance is this like performance. It's a sacred ritual, basically. It's a sacred dance done by temples, and um, it's usually done as a purification ritual of sorts. But it always tells the same story. Essentially, you have Barong and a monkey, and they are just playing together for a while the music plays. It's usually very cheerful in tone, and then as the story goes on, eventually Rangda shows up. And by this point, Barong has some warriors around him. And Rangda casts this like spell that entrances the warriors, Barong's allies. And they pull their knives out and they stab themselves, resulting in death. But then Barong proceeds to revive them with his own magic. And then that usually, like them coming back to life, usually sends or drives Rangda away. So, in the end, there's no real, winner, right? In this story, no one really wins, but it's not really a tale about winners or losers. Remember, it's it's more about equilibrium, meaning the story is more about the cosmic balance involving both good and evil and how they need to coexist. But yeah, basically, both Rangda and Barong, they're opposite sides to the same coin. Their existence depicts the Balinese worldview that they have, how life is full of opposing forces, which, I mean, I'm sure you've seen throughout your life. I mean, not just with good and evil, of course, but in nature or even in society. The myth basically tells you that evil cannot be removed, only managed or balanced through spiritual discipline. It's like a giant, never ending cycle that is very delicate and very easy to disturb, but the balance must be kept, or else everything falls apart. Hmm? Oh, sorry. I must have rambled on for too long. Thank you for listening to me, though. Was it fun to hear at least? I'm glad you enjoyed it. Here, let me show you some pictures of the dance. We could probably even watch it later if you want. I'll warn you now though. Barong and Rangda do have some like really big and piercing eyes. At least in every depiction that I found of them, they look kind of terrifying. But they're so interesting. Come here. I'll show you. Oh, hey again. Did you need something? No? Did you just want to spend more? No? Did you just want to spend more time with me? Alright. You know, I've been reading more about mythology lately. Would you care to join me for a while? Sure. Make sure you're nice and comfy. Are you ready? So, this time I was reading about Japanese mythology, specifically Izanagi and Izanami's myth. So, Izanagi is known as he who invites, while Izanami is she who invites. In time immemorial, so like ages ago, years and years and years and years ago, they were asked by the elder Japanese gods to basically bring form to the earth, since it was kind of like without any sort of shape and everything was in chaos. So, yes, this is a creation myth, partially. So they both stood on this floating bridge of heaven, known as the Ame no Ukihashi, and they used this giant spear to stir the ocean below them. After stirring for a bit and lifting the spear, some droplets drip off, and the first island of Japan was formed. It was known as Onogoro-shima, or Onogoro Island. They then descended upon this island and performed the sacred wedding ritual, where they circled the pillar of creation in opposite directions so they could meet on the other side. However, when they first attempted this, Izanami spoke first, and their marriage failed. See, the way the ritual normally works is you have the couple walk around the pillar, and when they meet on the opposite side, the man is the one that should speak first, saying something like, "Oh, what a lovely young woman you are." And the woman should respond with, "Oh, what a fine young man you are." This is all due to like how the gods back then believed in the whole like hierarchy of structured creation, and how they would need to be done, or how things would need to be done in the proper order, especially when it involves masculine and feminine forces. So, this ritual failed because the woman spoke first. And the elder gods saw this as improper and all that, which resulted in, well, deformed offsprings being born. One of the more notable ones being Hidoko, who is basically a god of misfortune. Anyway, the gods declare that the ritual needs to be redone, but correctly this time, with Izanagi speaking first. And once that's done, the 8 islands of Japan will be created, as well as, the rest of the Japanese pantheon. So, they try the ritual again, and it works. And they were very happy for a little while. But once Izanami gave birth to the fire god Kagutsuchi, she was unfortunately very, very badly burned, and she died shortly after, causing her to descend to the underworld known as Yomi, the land of the dead. Izanagi is crestfallen at the loss of his beloved, and he travels down to Yomi in order to find her and bring her back. After his long journey, he finally manages to find the entry to Yomi and begins to look for her. Now mind you, Yomi is basically pitch black for the most part. So he has to look for her in pitch darkness. Anyway, when he finds her, he begs her to come back with him, but since she has already eaten food from the underworld, she is unable to leave. Izanami ends up making a deal with the gods of the underworld, and they do agree to let her leave on one condition. Only if, on the way out, Izanagi doesn't turn back to look at her, ever. It's kind of like the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, where if Orpheus would look back to see Eurydice while they're escaping the underworld, Hades would drag her back in. He ends up breaking his promise by lighting a comb from his hair and using it as a torch. When he does this, he ends up illuminating the area around him, and he manages to see his beloved's decaying corpse while being surrounded by a bunch of spirits from the underworld. Of course, seeing her rotting corpse causes him to run away in horror. He's disgusted at the gods of the underworld who mocked him. He basically flees Yomi and goes back out through the entrance, which is basically like the entrance to a cave, and he seals it with a giant boulder. After being humiliated, she ends up vowing to kill 1,000 people every day. He screams back at her from the other side of the boulder that he will make 1,500 people be born every day. And this, basically, starts the cycle of life and death. It's known as Izanami's curse and Izanagi's blessing. So, a little bit afterwards, Izanagi ends up performing a ritual of purification known as Misogi, in order to cleanse himself of the impurities of death. After finishing this ritual, certain gods end up being born. Some prominent ones like Amaterasu, the sun goddess, Tsukuyomi, the moon god, and Susano-o, the storm god. And they end up doing, a ton of stuff in Japanese myth later on. But that's a story for another time. Well, if you'll listen. You will? Alright. I'll look more into them later on. We could have another chat like this later. It's been a little while since I've thought about all these mythological figures from around the world, but it's fun to read up about them and see how they influence things. It's crazy how a country so far away like Japan had a very similar story to that of one from Europe with Orpheus, isn't it? Still, I'll tell you some more next time, okay? Thanks for listening to me ramble on again, as always. I really appreciate it. Hello again, little one. I noticed you saw me reading and immediately started making your way towards me. It's cute. Were you curious about what I was reading this time? Well, luckily for you, I'm just about done with some of this. Would you like to hear about it? Alright, come here and get comfy. So, this time I was reading about Amaterasu and Susano, the sun and the storm god. Remember how some time ago I told you about Izanami and Izanagi? Well, when Izanagi escaped from the underworld, Yomi, he purified himself in a river with a Misogi ritual, resulting in three major kami, or gods, being born. Them being Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susano-o. Amaterasu was born from Izanagi when he washed his left eye, and she became the ruler of the heavens, also known as Takamagahara, or it's a little bit of a tongue twister, Takamagahara. Anyway, she is basically the embodiment of light, order, and divine sovereignty. We have Tsukuyomi, who was born from his right eye, and he became the moon god. And then we have Susano, born from his nose, being a storm god. And he is associated with, chaos and the ocean, raw emotions. Amaterasu and Susano do represent opposing natural forces, both the sunlight and storms, or, stability and upheaval, concepts like rulership and rebellion, um, which is quite interesting because in most Western mythologies, the concept that's usually opposed to um, sun or light is usually darkness. And in some cases, that's usually associated with the moon or some other entity, usually death as well. Um, so it's kind of interesting that for the Japanese pantheon or for Japanese mythology, it's the sun and the storms of all things. Anyway, so Izanagi wanted to assign domains to each of his children. Through this, Amaterasu would rule the heavens, Tsukuyomi would rule the night, Susano would rule the ocean or the sea. Susano, however, refused his duty, and instead he wept and raged, resulting in mass destruction. So he threw a fit. When he was asked why, he claimed that he wanted to see his mother, Izanami, in the underworld. Before he descended, Susano decides to visit Amaterasu. However, his violent arrival, him thundering across the heavens, made her very wary of him. So, she decided to test him. They ended up performing this ritual in which they exchanged some sacred items. Amaterasu took Susano's sword and created 3 female kami from it. Susano ended up taking her jewels and made 5 male kami. They both then proceeded to argue over who created the more pure kami, and Susano claimed victory. And of course, he was being arrogant and destructive while doing so. From this came a spree of chaotic deeds done by Susano. He destroyed Amaterasu's rice fields, he defiled her sacred hall, and then he threw a flayed horse into her weaving room, which made some of her attendants die from fright. Amaterasu was horrified by his actions, and thus hides herself in the celestial rock cave known as Amano Iwato. And this plunges the world into darkness. Of course, this is all, symbolism for why eclipses happen. Basically, if chaos runs rampant, then the sun will disappear from the sky. And remember, Amaterasu is like the literal sun. She's the personification of the sun. So just like, a way to represent the sun. So imagine just a person. Instead of it being a giant ball in the sky, it's, a woman. Well, Susano is just like a man, right? Anyway, the other gods, of course, wanted Amaterasu to return. So they gathered outside the cave and they performed this sacred but comedic dance. It was performed mainly by another goddess known as Ame no Uzume. She's another very prominent figure in the pantheon. And this dance basically causes everyone around her to be merry with laughter and excitement, which piques Amaterasu's curiosity. And she peeks out from behind the rock, causing the other gods to pull her from the cave and seal it shut behind her, so she cannot retreat. So that's a pretty funny scene. Here you have a bunch of gods just having fun outside of outside of a cavern entrance. And then Amaterasu gets really curious about why everyone's laughing and having fun. So they just pull her out and then seal the cave behind her. Anyway, this is all just like one big metaphor for the restoration of light and order. which results in Susano being banished from heaven. He gets cast down into the mortal realm and has his power reduced, which marks a turning point in things. So, now that Susano is in exile, he is forced to mature to control his emotions. And eventually, he does redeem himself. He fights a eight-headed serpent known as Yamata no Orochi, who was causing chaos in the mortal realm. So imagine just a giant snake, and I don't mean like, a few meters tall, right? Like this thing was huge. It was the size of buildings, or like the size of towers, and it had eight heads. And it was basically being satiated through human sacrifice. They would a lot of the locals would offer up innocent women for him to consume, which is pretty messed up. But he ends up slaying it, and during the fight, he cuts off his tail, and inside of Orochi's tail, um, Susano manages to pull out this legendary sword known as Kusanagi no Tsurugi. And that's what he uses to offer to Amaterasu in order to make peace with her, which allows their relationship to be mended. Now, the sword itself is very important. It ended up becoming one of the three imperial regalia of Japan. Basically, it's one of the three sacred treasures for the country, which is pretty neat. Like I said, there are three. The other two, if you're interested, are this mirror known as Yata no Kagami and a jewel, uh, which is the Sakane no Magatama. And they're all just representations of the virtues that are most important to Japan. The sword being valor, the mirror being wisdom, and the jewel being benevolence. Oh yeah. Regarding those treasures, so technically, no one has ever really seen them before. um, I guess maybe those outside of like the Japanese government, but Japan tells us they exist and that they have them somewhere, like in storage, right? Because they're very, very important to the nation. But we've never actually seen them. If you look at pictures of these things, you might only find like artistic depictions, as in either paintings or mock-ups done by people. Because again, like they've never taken a picture of these items and then just shown them to the public, which makes sense. I mean, again, they're very, very important to Japan, so we kind of just have to take their word for it. Anyway, let's look at some quick symbolism from this story. So, Amaterasu is, of course, the symbol of sunlight, right? As well as the imperial lineage and sacred authority, which we covered a while ago. She is this divine ancestor of a lot of Japanese emperors. Susano is a bit more of a complex figure. He's destructive at first. He's wild with his nature and then using his destructive force to be this heroic figure. So he's a literal, like, crazy force of nature and emotion before he redeems himself, eventually. Now, while the myth is a lot more complicated, it does signify the importance of the balance needed between order and chaos, and how even those who are divine are not exempt from needing to be humbled in order to be purified so that harmony can be restored. That's the like general gist of things. It's kind of interesting how, you know, the gods in most mythologies, they are revered, right, as these great figures. They are supposed to be the ultimate symbol for whatever it is that they represent, be it the arts, or just music, or, an element like the sun, or lightning, or storms, or, anything you can think of, wine, merriment. They're all these, like, omnipotent, just very powerful beings. And despite that, they still have a lot of quote unquote human traits to them, right? Like, here you have Susano. Again, he's the literal representation of, like, how crazy nature can get. So it makes sense that his emotions fluctuate all the time. But just imagine, like, a big brother just teasing his sister, but, like, being very rude about it. Like, a big brother would probably, I don't know. Let's say his sister is like a kid and he's, a teenager. He would probably, like, hide her doll or something, right? And tease her that way. She would be like, "Oh, what did you do to my doll? Blah 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 blah. Where is it?" Meanwhile, Susano thrashes her room and whips a horse to death and then throws it into another, like, part of her house. He's super messed up. But again, that's his whole character arc, right? Here you can see a lot of the just humanity that's that still inhabits these godly creatures. And it's pretty interesting. It's just an interesting thing to think about how, despite them being these godly entities, they still have quite a few flaws to them. Look at the time. It flew by, didn't it? Did you have fun hearing about the sun and the storm god this time? I'm glad. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about mythologies that I read up on. You're such an attentive little pupil. You know, maybe next time I'll quiz you, just to make sure you were actually paying attention. Still, that's it for today's lesson. When I research more stuff, I'll let you know, okay?